Hi, everyone. We are going to get started here in just a minute. And I'm super honored that you're here with me on this day where so much is going on in the world. All right. So one of the things that we will do in this part 3, authentic choice and voices, we will use the chat box for some reflection throughout. So feel free to use that to ask questions or just reflect on what I'm saying or share your ideas, because that's just one more way to keep it interactive. It's so weird sitting in my house presenting virtually. I don't know if I'll ever get used to it, much like I never got used to teaching virtually either. And so the chat box is really an easy way for you to reach out and connect with each other and connect with me as well. I will try to leave space in the presentation for you to ask questions and also for you to reflect out loud. And as usual, there's different ways that you can choose to reflect. You can reflect right in the chat box. You can reflect just in your head. Nobody needs to know what you're thinking. Or you can reflect out loud, which I know feels uncomfortable for a lot of people, just like it does with our students, but you're more than welcome to use this space as you would your own. So that being said, I do have closed captioned on here, but I'm going to start sharing my screen, and I'm not always sure what happens to the live closed captioning, so let's see what happens. So today is the final part of a masterclass that started all the way back in May, which is, I feel like a lot has happened since May. I feel like a lot happens every single day. And so this is really part 3 of what we started back in May. If you're just catching the end of this, I will be repeating this entire masterclass come August with a mindset of what does this look like if we are starting in a hybrid or in a virtual environment. And so there will definitely be tweaks and changes within that. So one of the things that I asked those of you who had done this masterclass, part 1 and 2, whether through the video or live, which choices do we remove from students, all or some on a regular basis? And also, what is the impact of that? So whether you got a chance to reflect on that question or you're just coming new to this question, will you reflect in the chat box? What are choices that we easily take away from students, and what might be the impact of that choice? And so go ahead and put your thoughts down in the chat box. I can say there are so many choices that we remove, and freedom is one of the first ones that we remove from students, whether it's limiting their book choice or how they write something or who they work with, or even whether or not they're invited into our learning space is something that we do with a lot of students. And so this is a question that we're going to think about as we move into this part 3, where we talk about really embedding choice and voice into as many components of our room as we can. Yes, the choice to decide how their learning is assessed is something that we often take away from students. And that's actually one of the components we will talk about today: how to present their information, the daily schedule, and what is learned when. Absolutely, that's the factory model of school, right? Here's when you learn it. Here's how old you are when you learn it, whether you're ready for it or not. And so I've been thinking about my own classroom, because I think right now it's really easy to feel this incredible urge to change the world, which I agree with as well. But we also need to make sure that we change our classrooms, because those of you who are educators need to really take a look at the practices that we have, because we are impacting the future of our nation through the practices that we put emphasis on and who we offer up importance in our classrooms. And so this is a journey that I've been on for about the last 10 years, and there have definitely been some books that have impacted my thinking along the way. The first one is Sarah Ahmed's Being the Change, which came out in 2018. Really a fantastic book that's applicable to all ages, that talks about how can we teach social comprehension, but it also has a section for teachers. What is the work that you need to do before you even start engaging students in this? Carla Shalaby's Troublemakers. It's a book I read a few years ago as part of the Clear the Air curriculum, and it is a book that has sat with me for a long time. It impacted and refined a lot of the thoughts that I already had, and Carla just writes in such an engaging way. What do we do to those children that we don't see as fitting the mold of school? Stamped, the remix by Jason Reynolds, remixed Dr. Kendi's book, Stamped from the Beginning, just came out in March. This is one of is the best book that I've read this year, and one that needs to be read by all educators. Unless you've read the adult version, you should still read the Jason Reynolds version and then hand it to students. And then White Fragility in my own work, as far as why is it I feel uncomfortable in certain situations and why are my reactions the way they are, including with students. And so why do I focus so much on choice in all the work I do? Well, for me, it's because I need to make sure that students understand that they have a lot more power. And maybe it's power that they haven't felt like they've had before, or maybe it's power that I can give back to them, or maybe they had it all along and they weren't aware of it. And so for me, everything I do revolves around choice, because when I remove choice, I'm removing freedom. And so when I can offer back choice, I can give kids more room for freedom within the learning environment. Now, just because we give someone choice, obviously, doesn't mean that they're always going to make good choices. And that's totally okay. I've said this before in parts of the other masterclass, that one of the biggest things that we need to make room for is that our classrooms should be spaces where kids can make poor choices, because they are in an incredibly protected, hopefully, environment with a caring adult that sees them for the whole human being they are, and not just as a kid who makes repeatedly bad choices. Now, that's not always the case. We see that in our expulsion rates, we see that in our suspension rates and in our punishment rates, and we see that as far as the predictable patterns within, for example, the American school system right now with the inequities that exist. But I think about what I can do within my own classroom to make sure that kids feel safe and also feel like they have an adult that has their back, even on their worst days. And so for me, I started to look at what are the different tenets of choice that I can offer. And we'll go into these more specifically, but at any given time in my classroom, students should have a choice in at least one of these. I try to give them as many choices in all of them at the same time, but sometimes things are just out of my hands, such as when they're asked to write a literary essay as part of our state standards, right? I can't be like, oh, I'm not going to do that if the standards have determined that I do that, but then I can do other things that provide them choice within the assignment. And so the first one we're going to go into is our actual classroom environment. Where will they learn something? Now, this doesn't mean like, oh, you can choose to go to the library or to the principal's office, but just like looking at our community and looking at our learning environment. Where is it that they want to sit when they're learning? Who is it they want to sit by? Because one of the very first things that we take away from kids, as I spoke about in my part 2, is that choice to choose where you sit and who you sit by. And we do it in our well-meaning intentions. Oh, those two talk too much, so I have to remove them. And thus we create rules for all of the kids that are in our care, rather than just thinking about the small adjustments that has to happen for those few kids. And so I think about this because giving kids freedom to choose where they work, for example, gives them freedom to manipulate and use the environment to access their learning in a better way. I still remember I used to be quite the stickler for making sure that kids stayed in their seats at all times and worked even during reading, etc., unless they were on the carpet with me. And I thought I had so many kids with kind of undiagnosed hyperactivity because they were falling out of their seats. Then I started spending more time in the chairs that I had in my own classroom, and I quickly recognized how incredibly uncomfortable they were. Then the next step in my reflection was, well, where would I want to work? Would I want to sit at this desk, or would I want to lay on the floor? Would I want to sit on the floor? Would I want to stand up? I'm a pacer by nature, and I prefer standing to being seated, and there was no space for any of those choices within my classroom. Now, you do know that you're going to have those few kids, right, that no matter what, are going to make really funny, terrible choices. They're going to immediately sit next to the kid that they love sitting next to, and they can sit and cook up fun things to distract all the kids around them. Those kids I just have private conversations with. You know, can we sit together? Is it going to work? Can you prove it to me? I'm going to give you one more chance. And if it doesn't work, then I'm going to ask you to sit far away from each other, but still have choice. And I'm going to help them through the reflection. And when I think about this, it's because we take it away so easily, and yet giving it back requires a little bit of work. Now, throughout the year, I have a couple of, assignments where kids don't get to choose where they sit because I purposefully want to mix them up so that they're not always seated by the same people. So we might have them choose their group, but then they're sitting with their group, and these are new people that they haven't worked with. We also work under a rule of no excluding anyone. And so if I see kids purposefully being excluded in a seating arrangement, then we stop and have a conversation, whether whole class or small group, about it. If a child chooses to sit alone, well, then I make sure that this is a choice that they made and not something that they were forced into. And that's a huge kind of social impact conversation that we need to have with kids too, because are you opening up your periphery as far as who might be someone that you can work well with, and are you kind of reflecting on that yourself? And so I think also what Cornelius Minor says, which is another great book, is his book We Got This, is that we can use our environment, and I mean literally our physical environment, to free or to oppress students, both with what we have on display, but also who gets to choose to move around, who gets to choose when they work with the teacher, who gets to choose that they work with their friend. And we can show kids which children have more power and value in our classroom through the amounts of freedom that we give them. Now, often I'll hear pushback from this idea of giving kids utmost freedom and that some kids can't handle it. No, that's true. That's absolutely 100% true. And then we have to start looking at historically, have they ever been given the choice, or have they always been restricted and thus never had the chance to sit and make these messy decisions? Because as adults, this is what we do, right? You chose whether you were going to come here today and do this live, or if you're going to watch the recording. You also chose where are you seated in your house or in your home. Maybe you're not in your home, etc. This is also that we can have the optimal learning experience. We need to offer the same choices for our students. Because I think about this, that there's been this huge push in education for flexible seating, right? Beautiful yoga balls and wobbly chairs and furniture that I wish I could afford, but that's no good if we also don't have, or if we don't pair that with flexible thinking. So who gets to make the quote unquote bad choices in our classroom speaks a lot about who we trust in our classroom, and also who then gets to have certain freedoms that maybe other kids don't have. And it's something that I am constantly working on myself, 100%, because if I don't, then I'm going to get stuck in predictable patterns, and I'm not going to give kids more chances. And I think that that's where we really start to see the multiple years of kids having limited choice. And so for me, this is what I live by. Rather than switching straight into that punishment mode when a child makes a poor choice, I'm going to try to pull them aside and reflect with them. Now, are there other cases where it's a safety concern and I'm probably not going to be reflecting with them at that moment? Of course. But for so many of the small things that kids kind of goof up in our classroom, there are so many opportunities for me to say, are you okay? First of all, and then what happened here and what can we learn from this, and help guide them through that reflection. And so a question I'd like you to reflect on here for a moment in the chat box or in your own head is, how does embedding choice into as many aspects as possible allow us to see the whole child and potentially see sides of a child that we haven't seen before? So I'm just going to let you reflect, and I'll read aloud some of the chats that people put in. I think one of the things that I've seen as well has been that choice isn't just choice in product. And that was huge for me, that I had to be able to kind of step back and go, wait a minute, there are other choices that I can afford kids and should be giving kids, not because I'm out to save them in some way, but because it's their rightful act to have that choice. And so, yes, we can see the humanity in all of us, and also how are we going to react to that choice? And so when I think about choices, it also inevitably ends up in who's doing all of the talking, right? That our job was never to be the sole voice in the classroom. It was to create space for students to raise their, and not just those who have earned it, whether through good grades or good attendance or always showing up on time and being kind and being friendly, but all kids. How are we making space for all kids? And when a kid disengages from our classroom, how are we welcoming them back in? And so I love what Isabel says here, right? That a classroom should be set up where students always have the opportunity to say whatever they want, as long as it's on topic. This was in response to a question of how I should change the classroom furniture. But to Isabel, this wasn't the major part of the conversation. It was more that the environment itself invited her to have a voice. And of course, my students, much like yours, I'm sure would love a pool or a coffee shop or 7 couches and maybe a gaming system in my classroom. But they know that that's not within our realm of possibility. So to create an environment where they feel like they can speak up. Unfortunately, this isn't always the case, right? Teachers speak way too much in our classrooms. I happen to know that I used to think I wasn't speaking too much, but it turns out that I absolutely do. And my students are the ones that will tell me, okay, Mrs. Ripp, you said 10 minutes, we're going to move on. So here's just a snapshot of that choices in setting that we can offer all kids. And this is just off the top of my head, right? Who are they seated by? How are they seated? Are they even seated? Is there space for them to do movement? And I don't mean just like a movement break, but movement throughout their work time. Can they physically move the furniture? I know a lot of this has to come down to the size of your classroom and what your furniture looks like, which is not always in our hands. How are they using technology if we have it? Are they using paper or computers? Where are they the noisy areas? Is that something that works for them or hinders them? Are they in a smaller area if we have access to that? Is there an adult close by or not? And how do they communicate that they need to change? Now, virtually, is it live or asynchronous? Is it typed or is it recorded? Or is their learning shown in some other way? Is it in the room that we would like to do it in, or in some sort of tech setting that they choose? Are they all prescribed the same tech tool, or do they have access to lots of things? And sometimes these choices are not ones that we get to make. So when we think about choice in setting, it is truly the entire environment that kids are in. And this then leads us into choice and engagement. How will they learn something? Because for a long time, many teachers have been trying to move away from kind of the lecture style teaching where everybody's at the same pace, learning the same thing at the same time and released at the same time. But then what does that look like? And so questions that I use as I continue with this work is, what do they already know? Which at the beginning of the year, I'm always kind of like, I assume they know nothing, and then I'm pleasantly surprised, because I used to assume that they knew a lot and then was very confused when they didn't know stuff. How will I make it equitable as far as the learning that they need? Those kids that want to be more independent and who are ready to give that, and by ready, I truly mean they think they're ready and I'm going to try to support that. How am I going to support that within my instruction? How will they have different choices and be able to take ownership? And what is my role in all of this? Are there other people that can support? Are there kid leaders that want to be leaders that can support? Are there other adults? And then, of course, how much time is the learning going to take when we offer up this many different choices? Because sometimes it is just easier to get up in front of the class and do a 15-minute mini lesson and then be done and move on and get into the work time. So one of the ways I think about this when I'm planning is I start to look at my standards. And so this is one of my standards, and it's kind of the big one that we do in 7th grade. It has to do with critical analysis. So if I know that this is a standard that I'm supposed to be mastering with my students, I also notice right away there is no product tied to this standard. It says ideas, themes, or story elements in a text. Okay. Well, text can take many different kind of formats, and we're even still playing with this standard. So, for example, if I want kids to now, within that standard, figure out how to find the main idea and be able to discuss it, I can give them a little survey sheet like this, where it's like, okay, your final product is 1, you're going to give me a 1 to 2 paragraph summary of this short story or articles. You're going to annotate the articles, which is work that they've already done before. And then at the time we used a Melcon format, which is really just a critical analysis of a piece. And in that, because I knew that this language was unfamiliar to many, I said, okay, I'm going to do a whole class lesson. But then after that, how would you like to access this learning and show off your learning? And so every child would fill in this survey. Now, then they would hand it to me and I would group my groups accordingly. A lot of kids at the beginning of the year would be like, I don't need help on this. And the first time I'd be like, okay, yeah, go do your thing. After that first time, so I would make it something really, really like kind of manageable and short. It'd be 1 or 2 days. After the first time, though, if a kid the second time said, oh, I don't really need help on this, and the first time showed me that they did, then we would reflect through that. Hey, do you want to come and just check in with me quick? Or, hey, on the first day of us working on this, I'm going to have you be a part of my small group on the carpet, but on the second day, I'm going to release you. And I think that that was also something that I wanted to do with my students, kids who felt like, ooh, I kind of want to work with a teacher, but I don't think I need a small group. I would just say, come work with us. And when you feel ready, like you've got the information, you can leave and you can go and work. And I also told kids that, let's say that they started out the first time they got this survey that they were like, I don't need any help with the annotations. I've got this. We've done it a million times. And then they start and they're like, ooh, I do need help. Come on in. Like, you're not locked into your choices. And even that I'm not sure yet, we would just talk about it. But what this allowed me to do before we would go into the learning is just to sit down and go, okay, who's in my small group? And sometimes my small group was 17 kids. You know, it was like the majority of the classroom, which also was assessment in itself. And other times it would be 1 or 2 kids and I would just adjust. And so this is one quick way to figure out how are you going to group kids. Now, let's say a kid picks their best friend and you've already seen in the year that they just don't work well together. They're goofy and they're funny, or they get nothing done, or they just sit and argue, or whatever it is that kids do. That's just a conversation that I have with them. And I'll tell them, like, this is what I saw last time. How are you going to make it different this time? It is very rare that I go in and say, you know what, that's not going to work for me. They would have to do some pretty egregious behavior to get to that point, because I want kids to sit and learn with it and go, okay, I really want to work with my close friend, but we don't work well together. How am I going to navigate that? Or if kids come and say, you know, I really wanted to work with this person, but they don't want to work with me. How do I navigate that? Let's have those conversations built into our classroom as part of our learning experience. So this is kind of like what it breaks down to. Okay, who needs to be in a small group with the teacher? This is open to all. I make no assumptions about where kids are at. And it's been interesting, right? Because a lot of kids with high anxiety will often want to come and be in the small group. Now, if a kid repeatedly chooses the small group and they don't really need to, I may have that conversation with them privately, mostly just to boost their own self-esteem and knowledge, and maybe hold up that mirror and say, do you know how much knowledge you have? But I will never exclude someone from a small group opportunity. Peer-led. Are there kids who want to do some peer-led groups? This should always be self-selected. And so I'll often have a master list of kids who did really well in an assignment, and then I'll approach them and they'll say, hey, I'm looking for 4 or 5 kids who want to help me out and run some small groups. Would you be interested? Here's what you would be doing. I never want to just look at a kid and be like, you're leading a group, because that kid may not want to. Partnerships is just students working with a selected partner. I do like to put kids in trios rather than partnerships. It helps with the exclusion factor, and it also helps kids just with like bouncing different ideas, so it's not so much of the high-low partnership. You kind of have kids in all sorts of placements in the work. Video support. I think we've all, or many of us, have gotten really good at making screencasts or other types of videos for virtual. And I'm going to continue that, because I want to have a video bank where kids can also go and just get that, maybe that 5 or 6 minute mini lesson, in case that's really all they need. They just need a refresher. And so I'm going to be working on pulling videos or creating videos for my students, and they will just be linked within our classrooms. And then, of course, are there other adults that can either kind of roam around the room if I'm sitting with a small group, or can they potentially pull another small group? Some of my classes, I have support from our incredible special ed staff, and most I don't, and that's just me, and I just got to make it work. So things that have helped my students stay engaged through all of this are having some choices within their engagement as well. For example, when we were online in the 10 weeks of online instruction that we just finished, I had both choices for long-term projects, where it was kind of like, go and work on this and I'll do a weekly check-in with you, or everyday projects. So they had the same due date, but that way kids had a way of going, I need accountability, I need to stay on track and do something every single day, versus, I got this, Mrs. Ripp, I have my independent kind of study figured out, and I just need you to check in with me. Now, mind you, kids may make the kind of the not so great choice the first time, and that's okay too. We need to get them into that first choice so that they can have a chance to then reflect on why didn't this work, or why did it work, and what do we need to tweak. You know, are we doing those live check-ins like I have on here? Also, that my students are 7th graders, but I think you can do this with 4th and 3rd and 5th graders. You just change the language as well. How are you planning on learning this? So kind of creating a learning plan in order to shift the ownership over. Micro progression charts, for example, this is from Kate and Maggie Roberts. Their fantastic book talks about them. If you Google micro progression charts, we're so quick to show students final products, like this is what it should look like when you're done. But what if like you're really at a beginning level and you just need to get it to the developing level, or you're an emergent and you want to get to kind of the next step. So I show them, what does it look like if you're beginning, for example, a paragraph? What does it look like when you're going to the next step, and then the next step after that? Of course, video screencasts that walk through lessons, maybe have drop-in study halls. This is especially for virtual, right? Offered by special education staff or other paras, or even yourself. We had a mental health support line from 5 to 10 p.m. that was staffed at all time for students to reach out to. And that was really helpful because it allowed me to kind of step away. So this is, again, in that virtual. And then, of course, having that team approach in your outreach at all times. So the last thing kind of with engagement, too, is make sure that you are doing your own homework. Because once I started doing this, this was huge for me, because I started to recognize just how much work I was actually asking students to do. And especially moving into middle school, where I am now just one cog in a big spinning wheel with a lot of lessons. And so one of my students also reminded me, and this is a quote I use often, you know, you would see how much we actually have to do. And so there are different things that we do as a team to try to limit both due dates and deadlines, but doing your own work so that you can work through the process also allows you to see where the pitfalls are that you may not have seen when you were planning. I'm going to take a moment and just turn my attention to the chat. Are there any questions up until this point? So. And if there isn't, then I'll just keep going. It also allows me to drink a cup of tea very quickly. And yes, Cabrina, your comment about conversation, reflection, inclusivity, yeah, that's like the cornerstone of everything I do. Do kids feel safe? Are we reflecting? How can I change? How can they change? And just making sure that kids feel safe. All right, well, I'll keep an eye on the chat as much as I can. It's on a separate computer. So choice in product is the one we think often about when we think about personalized learning, or, you know, offering choice at any point. What will they create to show their learning? And so back to the same standard. And this kind of took me a few years to recognize that this standard was not tied to a product, that the only thing that was limiting me was my own imagination. And so if I was able to kind of unprocess or pull out the standard, I could see that there were actually a lot of different choices. So I have to come back to, like, what is the essence of the standard and how does that apply to the learning we're going to do? Well, for me, this standard is really about critical thinking, right? I want students to come up with some sort of new thought that they haven't had before, that isn't penciled out for them in the text, and also not be afraid to embrace that and then look for evidence to support it. And the ta-da moment, of course, is that there are a lot of ways that they can show understanding once I understand that this choice in the standard really can be unpacked in a lot of ways. And so when I think about the different paths of learning, there's usually 3 different paths, and this goes for any long-term project in our classroom. There's the path that I have sat at home, meticulously created, right, and really put a lot of thought into. Go do this, and then this, and then this, and then this. Then there is the path that they kind of create with you. Maybe they come in and they look at your plan and they go, oh, I like this, but I don't like this other thing. Can we tweak it this way? Or I always tell my students, whatever idea you have, if you have an amazing idea, come back to me and then we can discuss it and we can make it work. Now, there are some ideas that are not going to work, but what pushed me into this number 3 was actually back in 5th grade. And we were doing, I think we were doing some sort, probably theme work. I feel like theme is one of the big ones that we're always come back to. I know my students are always like, theme again, Mrs. Ripp, really? But the student was wondering if instead of creating the poster or whatever I was having them do, if she could do an interpretive dance. Now, the first time she kind of approached me, I was like, wait, what? How are you going to show any kind of knowledge through an interpretive dance? And she says, well, I'll record the dance because she needed space, and then I'll do an artist statement. And I was like, you know what, let's try it. What do we have to lose? It was amazing. And I always give my students the interpretive dance option as well. And nobody's ever since taken me up on that. It's been about 8 years. But I think about that for that one child, they had this idea, and maybe none of the other kids wanted to do an interpretive dance, but it was easy for me once we had thought through it to go, oh yeah, I can see how this can still fit into what I'm assessing. So how can I work through this kind of critical analysis standard? Well, could they do the picture book, read aloud? Somebody, you know, there's a lot of wonderful picture books being read aloud online right now that are not breaking copyright, because please do pay attention to that. Could they listen to that and then analyze it? And they could show their analysis either written or recorded. Could they do some sort of independent reading with a one-pager where if you Google one-pagers for reading, you'll see these beautiful ones. I just had a very simple table where they had to choose 4 different things that they were going to do. Could they do a character autopsy, you know, where it's more drawing and visual and kids write small blurbs through a shared read alouds? We did a TED Talk short reflection where I selected a TED Talk every single day and then had a question that they had to go in and reflect on. And once again, it was about critical analysis of the TED Talk, but also connecting it to their own lives and pulling evidence from the TED Talk, all which fit into that standard. Could they do this work through a book club with either recorded or live discussions? And then once again, what are ideas that students have that you haven't even thought of? And so, for example, in our 10 weeks of virtual learning, here are some things that we did, right? We did a literary analysis, and these were all choices that they had. And again, that final question of what other ideas might they have so that their voice can be heard and so that the learning is meaningful to them. And so these are just, you know, kind of ideas out there. But doing this, you also have to think about what might stand in their way. First of all, motivation, which we see play out. Sometimes when kids are given too many choices, they freeze. And so sometimes for my kids, I have to be like, there's just this one choice, right? Because otherwise it becomes overwhelming. Maybe they need that chance to break it down with you, etc. Also, are they safe? Do they feel safe with you? I can't have kids, or I won't have kids take academic risks if they don't feel like I'm a safe adult to do that with. And so I have to think about the inequities that are present within my classroom and how I'm a part sometimes of those inequities as far as creating inequitable learning experiences for kids. If they don't see me as someone they can trust, well, then that is going to be an obstacle. If they're home, of course, but also at school, do they have access to books, materials? I have kids that cannot do work outside of class. I have to create projects where they can still be successful that does not depend on them having access to things outside of class. Where are they at with their executive functioning? I don't know about you, but in 7th grade, my kids are all over the place, right? Some kids, I swear, they're ready for senior year of high school, and other, we are very much still like just picking up the pieces around them and trying to help them. Their background knowledge plays a huge part in this, or other gaps in knowledge that can come from many different things. But also confidence. Do they feel like they can go on and create their own path? Do we really need to be cheerleaders as they kind of take baby steps into all of this? And then what is the relationship that we have as a community, but certainly also between teacher and student? And so then we kind of move into choice and assessment. And I don't always have this choice a lot because it's kind of a harder one, but I wanted to show you what you could use it for. So the what of what we're learning, right? How will they actually use their assessment to grow and not just let it be kind of like, oh, she assessed it, great, and then throw it out. And so which piece would you like me to look at and why? Because I try to have kids do many different pieces whenever possible. So for example, if we're doing creative writing, is there a section that you would like me to assess? Would you like me to assess the entire piece? Why are you telling me that this is your strongest piece? Because students always need to self-assess first. The minute that I put my ideas or assessment or feedback onto it, they're done. And so we also call it our best draft. And this is Kelly Gallagher language. He has inspired me to do that, because when I say something is your best draft that you're handing in, then when I return after they've kind of done some assessment and I've also done some assessment, we can then come back and we can revise, we can keep working with it. If I say your final product is due, well, then it's my final product. And why should I care that the teacher wrote all sorts of things or told me all sorts of things when I'm done with that? And so asking kids to take ownership over what they would like you to look at also tells them that they need to be critical reflectioners on their own pieces of work to say, well, which one does fit the standard, or which one was I really proud of, or which one did I actually complete because maybe I only completed one. And so I think about that self-assessment and how that's something we have to teach kids, because at the beginning of the year, typically with 7th graders, even when they've been exposed to this before, all my students are doing phenomenal. You know, I tell them to do an assessment and they're like, oh yeah, I'm proficient, 3s, 3s, maybe even 4s. Then I start to show them examples. You know, this is what proficient at a 7th grade level would look like. Now go back and kind of look at your own work, compare it. Are you better in some ways? Do you have things that you still need to grow and work on? And we think about, how will you know you have succeeded? We have that conversation. What will a good product or a solid product or something that has mastered what we're hoping you will master, what will that look like? What do you need to specifically work on? And so they also set goals before we get started. As we start to get into the project, I'll say to them, okay, now that you know what we're working on, because they've looked at the rubrics, we've talked about it, etc., how do you want to grow within this project? Have them set goals before they begin, and then how will they work on it? So these are all conversations that we should have with kids. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, my goodness, when do we ever get to the teaching if we're constantly having these conversations? But guess what? This is the teaching, because this skill is a skill that they should be able to apply to any place. You know, how am I going to grow as a babysitter? How am I going to grow as someone who goes out to a job? How am I going to grow as an active human being in this world? Okay, what do I already need to master? How will I know I've succeeded, etc.? Those are human questions, not just English project questions. So this is an example of what a rubric might look like in our classroom. And this was after we did a character autopsy for a shared read aloud, which was a way for me to teach a lot of different literary components, or reteach because they've already been taught a lot of them. We use the single point rubric because it allows us to write really specific feedback if they are below proficiency, if they're developing, or if they're beyond expectations. Because I don't know about you, but I know I would meticulously craft all these rubrics, and I would have all of the language written out, and the students would have no clue what it meant, despite me trying my hardest. And they would also kind of just glance at it and be like, oh, okay, I got this grade. This instead allows me to really sit and think, okay, why is it, for example, that I feel like, or that this is somehow more than proficient? This exceeds the expectations. What is it, so that I don't fall into kind of the patterns of like, oh, well, it's neat and organized and it's really long. No, there needs to be other reasons for that. Before I fill all of this in, though, they fill it in. What are you proud of in your character autopsy? And we talk about different things that they can look like, or they can look at, how have you grown as a thinker through this? How did this actually help you understand the book more thoroughly? And so we talk about that. What out of the big ones do you still need to work on? And then the ever important question is, how are you going to do that? Because as adults and kids, we are really good at setting goals and doing nothing with them. So I want my kids to kind of be invited into this and also say like, oh, okay, if I'm going to work on conflict, what are some tangible things that I can do to work on my understanding of that? Now, kids might not know. That then is a conversation waiting to happen. How can I help support you? Is there stuff we need to work on as a class? If most of my students say, which actually happened, I don't understand symbolism, okay, well, I need to plan some mini lessons on symbolism, and I can use picture books, etc., to do that, or video, or whichever. Then I fill out strengths, and then for the what you need to work on next, it is one thing. The biggest thing they need to work on, not multiple. I used to give kids lots of feedback. You need to work on dialogue, and you need to work on punctuation, and you need to work on adding more details, etc. What is the one big thing that is your next step? Because that way kids can feel like they have a goal and they have a direction. And it has really helped. Now, the first time kids see a single point rubric, if they're not used to it, they're very confused. And so we just break it down and work through it. And so when I think about back to that standard one of the analysis, right? What's my ideal? Like, what am I looking for when it comes is proficient? Well, it's these things, right? I have separate analysis for each piece of evidence presented that's believable, logical. I have this logical synthesis between evidence and original thought, and it's discussed in such detail that I clearly understand that the evidence proves the claim. If I put that language in front of my 7th graders, they would be like, what? I don't think they would know what we were talking about. So I have to unpack that standard so that they can understand what I'm looking for. But I'm also looking at, when I'm assessing them, how did they grow? What do I need to talk up? Like, oh my gosh, look at you. You found amazing evidence and you started analyzing this. This is huge. And then I have to link it to the non-academic world, because for a long time, my students are like, why do we do analysis? And I had to go home and I had to think about it, because at first it felt very like they were pushing back, right? Like, this is boring. Why do we need to do this? But I realized the truth in that question. Why do they need to do that? Because I should know as their teacher. And my answer cannot just be because you need it for next year. And so one of the things that I love about analysis work is that this is human work. We have to be critical thinkers. We have to be able to critically analyze situations in order to be successful in life, and sometimes even to stay safe. And so we talk about that with kids all the time, that critical analysis is really just teaching you how to pay more attention to the rest of the world. And we just happen to do it within literature because that's static and stands still, but then we can take those skills and apply it to other people. What are their next steps as far as what they already did, and help them kind of carve out that path? And then again, how can my feedback boost and build, not tear down? I cannot tell you how many times kids have come to me and said, but Mrs. Ripp, I worked so hard on it, and my red pen, whether it was red or not, had kind of tore them down. I want to be really, really cognizant of how my feedback, yes, is critical to the point of where they can work and grow, but not critical in the sense of that they feel like they have no way to grow because I don't see them as capable. And so when I think about, for example, the masterclass that I'm doing right now with passionate writers that started yesterday, it's so much of this is based in identity, right? Just like choices. Students need to feel safe when they hand over something for me to assess, because this is part of their identity and they've now put it down on paper. And so how I handle that is going to talk a lot about or how I see them as a human being. And so, as always, I always ask my students, and one of the questions that I asked them a few years ago was, what do you wish educators knew, and maybe even just adults, wish we knew about grades? And these were some of the big things that they came up with, right? That they don't feel like they have control over what grade they get. Now, wrap your head around that for a moment, because grades are supposed to be an indication over what they did, and yet kids feel like they sometimes just get assigned at a random level. Of course, a grade means that they are done, and that grades become sometimes the only thing that people care about, right? Whether it's the caregivers or the parents or even schools, that grades directly tell them whether they're smart or not. And that when we go and we publish honor rolls or GPAs, we've now taken their private learning and made it public. And unless we're asking kids whether they want that, we shouldn't be doing that practice because it's none of our business. And that also that grades are kind of for this undetermined future and not so much for the now. And so these are all conversations that we talk about, like, what does it mean to be assessed? And what can you use that assessment for? So we use it much more as a planning tool than as an end of the learning journey tool. And I love what Brooke says here. And Brooke is now, gosh, I think she just graduated. And, grades don't say how much I learned. It's just an opinion. People can't say how much I learned and how hard I tried because I'm the only one that knows that. I'm just looking at this question. Can you repeat why we do critical work and how it helps us in life? Yes, what I said with that, just why we do critical analysis work is because this is how we read other human beings. This is how we read other situations. So when I'm sitting and inferring in a book, it's just giving me practice for how I can apply that out into the world, which is also why it's so important that kids read really widely, that they come across situations that maybe they'll never experience in their own lives, so that they can connect with a character and then sit and think, well, how would I react in this situation? And this is why we do prediction work. This is why we do inference work, because text media of any sorts allow us all to step into a situation and then think through it in a very safe way, potentially before we meet that situation. And you know, a side note of this is why, like, relationships, as far as what healthy relationships look like, and even unhealthy relationships, are so important for kids to read about. And I know often in America we're very like, ooh, you know, this book had the maturity of relationships that we weren't ready for. And yet, when kids are exposed to that in literature, then it can teach them ways to navigate relationships that they're going to be in themselves. And so I think for me, that's why we do so much critical work throughout the year, is to give kids experience and to practice these these analysis skills, so that they can go out and apply it to their own lives. And that to me is just so important. And so the next choice is kind of the choice in timeline, like when will they be ready for assessment and feedback? Because it's not so much that, oh, sometime this year you should hand me a project that discusses TED Talks. No, but when do they feel like they're ready to have either you or other people come in and start giving them feedback on their work? And so this one is also a little bit harder to do at times. It kind of depends on the project that we're doing. And one of the things that I wanted to give them the space for was like, okay, within the next 3 weeks, you're going to show me mastery of these different things. And we talked about, like, that could be one final product, or it could be small products coming along the way. And then there was some choices there, because when they hand something in, it's an assessment in itself. When do they feel ready for you to look at it? You know, are they one and done? Right away, they're like, I'm good, there you go. And maybe they really are, and they need a different challenge, or maybe they're not at all, and you need to do further teaching. Or on that last day, even you've been checking in and they're still dragging their feet. Well, that's assessment in themselves. What do they need to get to some sort of finish points? And so there's also other choices in this timeline, though. When do you meet with peers or partners? And then for how long do you meet with them? Because this is something that I embed in my reading and writing, is that choice of who you're working with, because we're going to have different comfortability with different people. And so it's been very important for me that I give that choice back to students. How long do you actually meet with them? When does the teacher come into all of this? You know, I have a checklist so that I know that I'm conferring with all kids, but I also have kids just sign up, and some kids really want to meet with you every day, whether it's anxiety driven or they just want a quick check-in, whereas other kids are like, I would prefer to never meet with you. And so that's why I keep a checklist. Where are the milestones that you would like to reach as far as getting feedback? When I say, you know, give me your best completed draft, what does that mean to you? And then again, thinking about how else can students kind of manipulate this timeline to fit their needs better? How much leeway can we give them? And so coming back again, when you think about all of these choices, right? That's a lot of different choices that we can embed into our instruction, and we can just navigate it at, age appropriately. Who doesn't get those choices? And how often do our assumptions trigger the removal of some of these choices? So like an easy example that I've worked through in my own practice has been book clubs. That when we do book clubs, if a child is not at grade level for reading, we often remove choices from them because we want them to have accessibility to the text. We also often group them with kids that they've been with before, especially if they have special education labels, because then it's easier for us to kind of manage their support. Think about that. If that's what's happened to you every single time there's a book club, right? I mean, no wonder you feel like maybe you're not as good enough as the others because you're not giving the same choices. And so one of the things that I kind of had to think about and connect with in my own practice was the idea, for example, for book clubs, that a book club is about discussion. It's not about decoding of the text. It's about sitting and reading something And so how can kids access a text that may be outside of their decoding abilities? They can do it through audiobook. And that way we can still scaffold and support them, and they can get the full range of choices just like their classmates, and also get the full range of choices of who they're with. My job is to support each child in the best learning environment that they can be in. And that includes thinking about the freedom that they have to be just like their peers. This also comes from me as a mama bear. I have 2 kids with IEPs, and one of them is specifically on reading. And I've had to put protections into her individualized education plan to make sure that she still gets full reading choice, that she still gets to have independent reading, that she still gets to choose her own books. And it's not because the system that she's in has tried to take it away, but I'm worried that it might. And I think about the kind of the crazy notion of that, because of course there are certain rights that kids should have with us. And one of them is to be able to choose what they are going to independently read. And so I think about this language and thoughts and action, how that all rolls into either harming or boosting children. And Jason Reynolds' tweet from May 29th that was directed at the president was so powerful to me, because when we put labels on kids, and here in the instance he's talking about thugs, you don't have to call us children, but I think about that and how it plays out with data or with labels that we affix to kids in order to navigate their educational journey easier in our meeting and our planning. But how does that dismiss all of their identity, right? And so I think about that a lot in my own practice. If I have this instinct to possibly remove a choice from one child or a couple of children, I have to sit with that and think about why. What has triggered that instinct to remove that choice, and where is that coming from? Because how we speak about children, as we talked about in one of the other master classes about perception in part 2, how we perceive children has an incredible ramification for the educational journey that they're on with us, because we go out and we share our assumptions through our language with other adults. And so as we're kind of getting closer to the end of this master class, I also want us to think about what are the hard conversations that we're having within our school environments. Are there practices, both within our own sphere of influence, but also school-wide, district-wide, that we need to start questioning? Because I've seen, for example, over the last couple of weeks, a lot of districts come out with some really beautiful statements about how they're committed to anti-racist work and how they want to make a change. I need to see that happening. The whole world is waiting for that to happen. So how is that going to happen? We have to feel brave enough, us practitioners, to start raising our voice when we see harmful practices, because it is really easy to come out with beautiful vision statements and other statements in general, or even to sit over the summer and plan for these beautiful changes. But what's not easy is actually putting in implementable steps that offers change. And so also thinking about whose voices are being listened to. And if you feel like your voice is not being listened to, how can you get it amplified? Who needs to be a part of the conversation? And then also step back and say, whose voices are not even invited into the conversation? Do we have the voices of our student, and not just those who have figured out how to navigate school at the table when we're making huge decisions? Do we also have the voices of the disenfranchised, of the disengaged, of the kids that feel like school is not a safe place for them? Are they part of our conversation, of our planning, of our professional development? Because without them, we're not listening to the whole story. We're not getting the whole story. And the same thing goes for our community, because it's really easy to be like, well, they didn't show up to orientation day, so I guess they didn't want to be a part of the conversation. How are we inviting them into spaces where they then feel safe enough to share their voices with us? And so this is such a small snippet of the journey that I have been on, and I highly encourage you to continue kind of questioning, where can we put in authentic choice and voice within our schools, both our districts, but also on a classroom basis, and learn from others. And so I wanted to make sure that I gave kind of some special acknowledgement to those who guide my journey. And the first ones are, of course, my students, and also the caretakers, the adults in their lives. But also all of these resources have really shaped my thinking for many years or more recently, Nehemiah is a local project out of Madison here, but it is doing phenomenal work, and it should be known throughout the U.S. No white saviors, clear the air community, disrupt text. I've mentioned several occasions, etc. Like, who is helping me shape my thinking and allowing me to reflect more deeply? And so I also want to say that as I wrap up with kind of the words of my student, is that don't feel overwhelmed. I just laid out 10 years of work, 10 years of realization, 10 years of changes that I have embedded into my classroom to where they now are a habit. If you're just starting on this journey, take one step, plan for one thing, pull one unit where you're going to embed more choice. And then as you get comfortable, add more, continue the reflection, always reflect, always plan for change, but don't compare your journey to mine, because we're all on different journeys and we all work within different kind of frameworks and have different obstacles that we're facing. But I love Carrie's words here, and she actually graduated, so she's definitely no longer a 7th grader, but she was a 7th grader at the time, that she hopes that we look at everything as if they were the student. And I would follow this up with, and then ask the students, because again, we can look at it and see how students might think of this, or we can simply give them the space back so that they can raise our voice. And so we have about 5 or 6 minutes left, and I'm now open for any of your questions. You can do it in the chat box, or you can do it, turn on your microphone. But I have office hours every single week, which I'm so excited about. The first one kicks off again on Monday. And this is a great time to drop in. It's 8 a.m. PST, but to say, hey, you mentioned this, can you talk more about that? Or, hey, I have this idea, can we talk about it? Or if you're doing the global read aloud or anything like that, this is your chance to just drop in or learn with other people, and we can talk about problems with practice. But I have this ongoing masterclass, Building a Community of Passionate Writers, and that continues. And then the other masterclasses have been published on my blog, and they will be put into the calendar soon. But I'm doing a reading one later in July, and then I'm repeating this one, like I said, once we know more about the fall. I'm going to make a tweaked version for that. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and just hopefully look at your questions, if you have any. Okay. And if there aren't any questions, then that is okay.
Hi, Pernille. My name's Laurel. I'm at an independent school in Hawaii. And I've been focusing the last year or so on bringing more diverse books into my classroom, and I actually created a whole separate section for it. And more recently, I've been really questioning that, like, is putting these books in a section that says these are diverse books, is that creating this whole other mess? But if I want to draw students' attention to them, how can I then, sort of highlight them without creating this sense that these are other from us?
I think so to answer your first question, absolutely. They should be spread throughout our library in whichever classroom collection, in whichever way that makes sense. They should not be in their own separate section. Chad Everett wrote a beautiful book, or not book, blog post, also about even the use of the term diverse, that the minute we say these books are diverse, then we're once again centering whiteness as the norm, right? White, cisgender, heteronormative, core family kind of thing. And so when we say, here's our diverse section, then we're saying this is outside of the norm. So one of the things that I've done in my own classroom, and I would highly recommend that you read his blog post. I'll try to find it. If I was good at multitasking, I'd throw a link in here. I think if you just Google Chad Everett diverse text, it comes up. But okay. I have them by genre, and I book talk, because I think about that a lot, that kids, Linda Gambrell reminds us, they read what we bless. And so when I'm book talking a book, I'm not going to stand there and be like, and this has a Black character facing lots of struggles, right? Like, I just talk about the book in general and then get kids hooked in with that. I also think about my displays all throughout the year. What are we using as mentor text? What are their book club choices, etc., so that that inclusive text is always at the center of the work we do, and not just when I have them pulled on that section. And one of the things too that I've stopped doing somewhat, for example, if a young adult romance book is really like a gay relationship, I don't even mention that. I just book talk it like I would any other relationship. So again, that doesn't become this otherizing. Now inside of it, because I have kids that are specifically going for LGBTQ plus books, I have that written on the inside cover, because my kids go in and look at the books and they'll be like, oh, realistic fiction, personal struggle, PG-13, LGBTQ plus or whatever. And they're like, boom, that's exactly what I wanna read. Yeah. Oh, thank
so
you.
you put like a little label inside the book.
I just write it. Yeah, I just write it. And I also show them, right, that books can fit into a lot of different places. And so because we kind of have our classroom collection in bins and by like mini genres, like a sports book might have sports, but it might also be personal struggle. And it's probably, you know, PG-13, which my kids know is kind of the rating for when it's a little bit more mature. And it might be a free verse book. And so they're going to have all 4 abbreviations of that. This is like me pretending to hold up a book
Right.
on the inside cover for that. So then kids know that it's multifaceted, right? And I can do that in a classroom collection. I know in a large library collection, you kind of have to pick where they're going to be. It's a little bit easier in my classroom where they can kind of go in different bins.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Great question. Yeah. Other questions? I can't believe you all showed up. Thank you so much.
Hi, Pernille. This might be, well, first of all, thank you for doing this. I was thrilled to show up, actually. This might be an office hours question for you. The thing that I read Passionate Readers last year and really tried, like what you suggested, putting it in one unit, like my first unit, built in the choice. So now I'm ready to take the next step, which would be the products. Like, so the note that, you know, when you said get to the end and show mastery, that's where I really struggle. Is like, would they produce a whole bunch of products and then they look at them and say, this is how I'm showing mastery? That's where I have a hard time managing that whole thing.
They could. They could. I would say if you're just getting your feet wet, then I would give them, like, I would say maybe they have 4 different choices in type of product, and the 5th choice being, or do you have a better idea? But I would just have them work on one thing. Now, knowing that that one thing could be a collection. So I'll give you an example. And that, yes, we could talk more about this in office hours, but I'll give you kind of a brief answer. I had kids in virtual learning right now. One of their choose their own learning adventures was creative writing. And so in that creative writing, you know, after the 3 weeks, they were going to give me a piece, and it was going to be assessed all the same way. But they had a few choices. One was a story, right? Like a short story, write a short story, and there you go. Or they could write a chapter of a longer piece, because I have some kids that have been working on like a book, right? They want to write a book. And so they just needed to give me a chapter from that book. Or they could do a poetry collection where they did 5 separate pieces of poems or poetry, all centered around a theme. Or they could do a novel and verse chapter, or they could do a comic strip or some sort of graphic representation of story. And what that offered me up was that because I was assessing them on like organization and word choice and level of detail was the narrative standard, that could be assessed in any ways through those products. And so I just had a few things that they could choose that they already felt comfortable with. And then, like I said, I let that option, hey, do you have some sort of idea that I hadn't thought of that would work? And we would just talk about that.
Okay. Yeah, I will check in with office hours.
Yeah, please do. We can.
Yeah, before that and try to, and we're doing global read aloud, and I think the other teacher who is actually on this right now and I have a big question about global read aloud. So we'll check in next week with you.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Any other questions? Otherwise, feel free to join me in office hours. Okay. Well, then I hope you stay safe and that you're well wherever you are. And thank you so much again.